You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. Thousands of Germans have taken to the street demanding that Nord Stream 2 should be opened to mitigate the desperate economic condition in their land. Also, the pound is crashing and the Italian elections have been dominated by the right-wing Brothers Party. Joining us now to discuss this, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Press TV reports thousands of protesters took to the streets in the northeastern German seaside town of Lubmin on Sunday, urging officials to put into service the halted Nord Stream 2 pipeline project that was designed to transport fuel from Russia to Germany. Dr. Horne, what we're seeing now is kind of a clash, and that is the European leaders sitting in the middle. On one side, they've got the Biden administration saying, you've got to hold on any minute now, the Ruskies are going to fall. And on the other side, we've got their actual constituents saying, we can't wait for the Ruskies. We're about to fall right now. Dr. Horne.
Well, I'm not sure what these leaders are looking at. If you look at the value of the ruble before February 24th, before the advent of the special military operation, as it's called in Moscow, it was trading at 70 plus to the dollar. Now it's trading at 57 to the dollar, so it's actually strengthened. And indeed, you would not necessarily be off base if you thought that the so-called Ruskies are actually trolling their neighbors to the west. There was a report recently that in St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad, they're thinking about heating the sidewalks. I guess that the implication is that homeowners in posh, chic, and Tony London can move and be warm on the sidewalks of Russia. And with regard to the crisis in London, it's obviously, in a sense, engineered. That is to say, the incoming Liz Truss administration regime, the second coming of Margaret Thatcher, has embarked upon a Reagan-esque program of cutting taxes and then borrowing to make up the shortfall. And many entrepreneurs and capitalists are not buying that harebrained prescription, and they're bailing out. I recall a time when the British pound was worth $2.40. It's now headed to parity. That is to say, $1 for 1 pound. Now, that may be good for tourists from the United States. It's not clear if it's good for British consumers, because even though the price of a barrel of petroleum may be falling in a certain sense, if you have to buy that petroleum in dollars and you don't necessarily have enough dollars because of the fall in the British pound, you're still going to be stung quite viciously. And with regard to Italy, I'm afraid to say that this result had a certain predictability to it. What I mean is, if you go back to the Cold War, a strategic objective of U.S. imperialism was weakening the Italian Communist Party, one of the strongest left-wing parties in the world. It didn't matter that the Italian Communist Party tried to move away from Moscow by formulating this so-called Euro-communist notion, just like it didn't matter that Yugoslavia, under Marshal Tito, broke with Moscow as early as the late 1940s. Yet Washington still sought to destabilize and break up socialist Yugoslavia, which they succeeded in doing in the 1990s by bombing Serbia, the kingpin of Yugoslavia, into smithereens. Its neighbor to the west, speaking of Italy, was also destabilized. Recall the 1947 election, where the United States rustled up its Italian-American citizenry to contact its counterparts in the homeland to vote against the communists, which they proceeded to do. Recall as well one of the more chilling episodes of the entire Cold War, when the Christian Democrat Prime Minister Aldo Moro in the 1970s was about to execute the so-called historic compromise and invite the Communist Party into the councils of government. And U.S. imperialism objectively collaborated with ultra-leftists to kidnap him and execute him so he could not carry forth that plan. In fact, there have been a number of movies made about that, including Italian movies such as The Moral Affair. So when we get to the present and we see the so-called Brothers of Italy surging to power, a neo-fascist party, a party that makes apologies for Mussolini, the only folks who should be shocked and surprised are those not paying attention.
You know, I did want to ask you that. It's interesting that because, the term is being used, fascist, neo-fascist, et cetera. Now, recently, and I'm sure you followed this, Ursula von der Leyen talked about the Italian elections, basically saying if it goes the wrong way, we have things we can do, such as in Hungary and Poland, we have things that we can do. And I think to myself, that sounds like fascism to me. That sounds like, and I hate to say it, but kind of hearing her say that with that German accent, kind of gives me great pause. But what do you think about the idea that Ursula von der Leyen is giving us a different a version, a different flavor of fascism. But when you start saying countries within this bloc do not have the right or ability to select their own government, or we will act, am I wrong in saying that smells like fascism?
I would say it's a case of thieves falling out, which oftentimes tends to happen. They can't agree on how to divide the booty. I'm no friend of Ursula von der Leyen, as close and alert listeners to this program should be well aware of. But at the same time, we should not carry a brief for the Brothers of Italy. Look at the Twitter feed of the incoming Prime Minister Meloni. It's been a blatant anti-African campaign because, as you know, as a result of the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya in 2011, you've had many Africans streaming across the Mediterranean into Italy. In fact, she's used some tropes that would make Klansmen in the United States blush, including Africans raping dainty European women, so-called white women, etc. It's a blatantly, violently anti-African, anti-immigrant party. And we should be quite concerned because we know that this is part of a wave. It's a wave that includes the recent Swedish elections that just took place a few weeks ago, where you had a neo-fascist party surging into influence. We all know what's happening in the United States of America. And once again, your audience should be made aware that once the United States embarked on this Cold War platform of destabilizing communist parties, destabilizing left-leaning unions, it was inevitable that, like a seesaw, rising would be neo-fascist and ultra-right-wing elements. So Ursula von der Leyen, who was a lieutenant during the Cold War, should basically be told, physician, heal thyself, which of course is appropriate given her past profession.
And let me ask you this, looking forward, what do you think happens? There's thousands of people in the streets in Germany. We've seen recently in Brussels, we know the winter time is coming and the people are not going to be happy. And for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Do you think we're looking at more right-wing parties? Is this so what's coming up for the winter politically and socially as far as the EU?
Well, socially, I regret having to say that many people might be migrating to the sidewalks of St. Petersburg. At least they can stay warm there. Politically, I'm afraid to say that dark days are ahead. Those who did not campaign and complain during the Cold War and acquiesce either through omission or commission to the destabilization of left-wing forces, they should not be shocked and surprised that now we're about to undergo a bout of right-wing populism. And I must say, in the United States, there needs to be clarity on this point, because I listened to an interview by David Corn of Mother Jones talking about his new book, American Psychosis, describing today's Republican Party and its surge to the right. But he neglects what I point out in my book on Texas, the counter-revolution of 1836, which is that in the United States, if fascism comes, it will have a mass base. And to act like it will not, and it'll just be some maneuver executed at the top, is fantasy of the worst order.
I did want to ask you this, and this is my thought. I guess I don't want to see anybody suffer ever, particularly for the sins of their fathers, right? But when I look at what colonial Europe has done to Africa particularly, but, recently they were involved in the overthrow of Bolivia, and we can do Spain with South America and all of that. I find some level of, and I hate to say this, but there's some karma going on here when they are literally turning themselves into what we used to call third world country at the behest of the U.S. empire, that after all of the sanctioning and making all of these poor brown and black and yellow people suffer all over the world, that now that colonialism is visiting itself upon the European continent. Certainly, I don't want any Europeans to suffer, but this is not my choice. This is theirs. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, I understand your sentiment, and certainly there is a bit of chickens coming home to roost with regard to European policies. Look at Italy, for example. It was late to the colonial feast, but it tried to compensate by being ever more vicious in the Horn of Africa, where it sought to colonize today's Somalia and also Abyssinia, meaning Ethiopia, using poison gas against Ethiopia in the 1930s. It was one of the first countries to use airplanes as a weapon of war in 1911 in attacking Libya, North Africa. And as well, it's appropriate for you to draw this comparison with developing countries, because one does not have to be an oracle or have a crystal ball to suggest that what's happening in the larger scheme of things is that European nations are making a great leap backward into the era of preceding development, whereas Asian nations in particular are making a great leap forward. And so this is a historic trend. Europe and its U.S. ally could have avoided this trend with saner policies, but they were congenitally, and I choose that term carefully, congenitally unable to do so. And
would you say it would be valid to argue that the U.S. empire itself has sacrificed, they sacrificed the lives of the Ukrainians as cannon fodder, and now basically economically they're doing the same thing with the Europeans? Dr. Horne.
Well, they are. And I don't know if I mentioned it before, but it bears mentioning right now that the United States feels that it's self-sufficient in energy, although the strategic petroleum reserve has been declining precipitously in light of Mr. Biden unleashing so many barrels months ago to compensate for the Europeans cutting off Russian petroleum, Russian oil. The latest news is that there might be a natural gas crisis in the United States because it's a unitary market, and it's difficult for the United States to escape unscathed as Europeans are freezing. And likewise, it appears to be that if you heat your home with oil, that the trucks pulling up to your door within coming weeks will be demanding cash on the barrelhead or some other kind of payment, and credit is going out the door. So this is a global crisis. It could have been avoided with saner policies, but alas, that seems to be beyond the ken of these politicians of the North Atlantic bloc.
We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, researcher. He's got a lot of anywhere that books are sold, go online. Dr. Horne has a lot of books out. My favorite one that I would recommend, of course, is the one about Paul Robeson. Dr. Gerald Horne, thank you very much for spending